Story 1. This happened back in 2016. I used to live in a small, quiet town where everybody pretty much knew everyone else. The whole area was surrounded by flat land and thick forests, so there was not much to do unless you loved hiking or camping. Otherwise, you had to drive an hour to reach the next slightly bigger town for entertainment. My buddy Jack and I went camping a lot, and one day he told me about a spot his other friend had suggested. It sounded like an adventure, so we decided to check it out. The place was not far, just a 15-minute drive from the edge of our town. There was no designated parking, though, so we just pulled off to the side of the road. The trail leading to the spot was faint and narrow, not something that seemed well-traveled. We followed it, hiking for about an hour, until we reached what was supposed to be the campsite. Jack's friend had mentioned a beautiful lake view, but when we got there, we realized we had been duped. It was not a lake at all. What we found was more of a swamp, dark green, overgrown, and far from scenic. It might have been nice a few years ago, but not anymore. We laughed it off, trying to make the best of the situation. Then Jack pointed out something across the water. It was a tent, sitting all by itself among the trees on the opposite side. It was too far to make out any details, but the sight of it was a little odd. As I scanned the shoreline, I noticed something else. Someone was standing there, right along the edge of the swamp, directly across from us. I gave a quick, friendly wave to avoid making it awkward. Jack and I figured they were the ones staying in the tent. After that, we set up our own tents on a small hill, a safe distance away from the water. We spent the rest of the day playing games and talking. Every now and then, we glanced toward the swamp, but we never saw the person near their tent again. Either they were off wandering in the woods or not there at all. As the sun set and darkness started creeping in, we noticed we had not seen that person for a few hours. We gathered some wood to start a fire, pulled up our chairs, and cooked dinner. We were laughing and having a good time when Jack suddenly froze. He jumped out of his chair, his eyes locked on something behind me. I spun around to see what he was staring at. Standing in the shadows, about 20 feet away, was a figure. They had long, messy black hair and dark clothing. It was too dark to tell if it was a man or a woman, or if they were holding anything. "Hello?" Jack called out. "Are you okay?" I added, trying to sound calm. The person stood there for a moment, then quickly turned and disappeared into the woods. Jack and I exchanged uneasy looks, nervous smiles on our faces. We were both spooked, but we tried to laugh it off. We figured it was probably the same person we had seen by the swamp earlier. We came up with some kind of excuse for why they might have been there, though, honestly, I cannot even remember what we told ourselves anymore. Whatever it was enough to keep us from panicking. We managed to stay up a little longer before finally heading to bed. Looking back, I have no idea how we felt confident enough to sleep after that, but we were young and probably a little too fearless for our own good. In the middle of the night, I woke up to Jack unzipping my tent and shaking me awake. His face was pale, and he was breathing heavily. He said he had woken up to the sound of someone moving around outside. When he peeked out of his tent, he saw that same person standing right next to mine. As soon as they noticed him, they bolted into the woods. Jack was terrified, and I knew I had to keep calm for both of us. Our choices were limited. We could either risk hiking back through the narrow trail in total darkness or stay put at the campsite. We decided to stoke the fire and stay up until sunrise. We packed up all our gear, ready to leave at a moment's notice if we had to. The moment the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, we grabbed our stuff and got out of there as fast as we could. The next day, after talking it over, Jack and I decided it was best to report what had happened to the local police. We figured it was worth letting them know about the strange person we saw, just in case it could help keep someone else safe. It felt like the responsible thing to do. To our surprise, later that same day, we got a call asking us to come in for questioning. That definitely caught us off guard. When we got to the station, the officer explained that the tent we had seen by the swamp belonged to someone who had been reported missing over a month ago. Hearing that sent a chill down my spine. They had already searched the area after our report but had not found anything else. Then they showed us pictures of the missing person. Jack and I both took a good look and were absolutely certain it was not the person we had seen by the swamp. That realization was deeply unsettling. It meant that whoever we saw that night was someone else entirely, and they might have had something to do with the disappearance. The thought made my stomach turn. I could not shake the idea that, if Jack had not woken up and scared them off, things could have gone very differently. I might not even be here to tell this story. Story 2. I had decided to spend the night camping out in the woods behind my house. I own a decent stretch of forested land, and every now and then, I like to take advantage of it. Nothing too adventurous, just a short hike, maybe 10 or 15 minutes from my back door, to a little campsite I cleared for myself. It is not anything fancy, no scenic views or lakes, just a quiet patch of woods where I can unwind. This particular trip took place in the middle of fall. The leaves were just beginning to carpet the ground, and the air had that crisp edge to it. Around 4 in the afternoon, I grabbed my gear and headed out. Once I arrived, I started setting things up, pitching my tent, getting my little fire pit ready, and arranging my chair. While I was busy, I noticed someone moving out in the distance. They were about 100 yards away, just walking through the trees. It struck me as odd because, technically, they should not have been there. My land backs up to my neighbors' properties, so the only way someone could have gotten to where I was would have been by crossing through private land. I was not mad, more curious than anything else. They seemed to be walking away from my house, heading toward one of the neighboring properties, so I decided not to dwell on it. For the next few hours, the woods were quiet, just the way I liked them. I sank into my chair, listening to the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees and the forest grew dark, I had a good fire going, with plenty of sticks and logs to keep it alive. It was around 9 o'clock when I heard the first sound. It started as faint, rhythmic footsteps coming from deeper in the woods. I turned my head, straining my ears, and the sound grew louder, someone running, full speed, through the trees. My campfire lit up the immediate area, but beyond that, the forest was pitch black. Whoever it was ran past my campsite, their footsteps pounding against the ground, then faded into the distance. I sat frozen for a moment, my mind racing. It was definitely a person, there was no mistaking the sound. What they were doing sprinting through the woods at night, though, I had no idea. It left me uneasy, but I told myself they probably did not even notice me sitting there. Maybe they were lost or in a hurry to get somewhere. I figured if they had wanted to bother me, they would have. Trying to shake off the nerves, I stayed out by the fire for another couple of hours. The woods were eerily silent after the runner passed through, and by 10 o'clock, I was ready to call it a night. I let the fire die down, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep. I do not know how long I was out, but I woke suddenly to the sound of heavy footsteps. My heart jumped into my throat as I realized the steps were getting closer, fast. Someone was running straight toward my tent. I sat up just as the steps stopped, right outside the thin fabric. I held my breath, staring at the faint silhouette of someone standing there. They moved slightly, rocking back and forth, like they were trying to peek inside. Then came the sound of fabric tearing. My stomach dropped as I saw the blade of a knife slicing through the side of the tent. A pair of eyes appeared in the gap, staring straight at me. Instinct took over. I threw myself out of the tent and bolted into the woods, yelling at the top of my lungs. Branches whipped against my face as I sprinted blindly toward my house. Adrenaline carried me the whole way, and I never once looked back. When I reached my back door, I fumbled for my phone and called the police. As I waited for them to arrive, I looked out the window and felt a chill run down my spine. There, in the shadows of the trees, was a figure. They were standing still, watching my house. By the time the officers showed up, the figure was gone. The next morning, the police came back to check out the campsite. They combed through the area but found nothing. Days passed, then weeks, with no answers. The thought of someone lurking in my woods, armed with a knife and bold enough to follow me to my house, left me on edge. It has been a month since that night, and so far, nothing else has happened. I am still sleeping with one eye open, though. If anything changes, I will make sure to update you. Story 3. It was 3 years ago, right at the start of December. Where I live, the cold does not really settle in until the end of the month, and snow does not usually show up until January. I go camping quite a bit and always try to squeeze in as many trips as possible before winter fully sets in, making it impossible to camp for several months. That year, I had taken some time off from work for the first weekend of December, planning one last camping trip before the season turned. I picked a spot about an hour's drive north of my home. It was a bit cooler up there, but I figured the difference would not be drastic. Besides, I had gear that was rated for colder weather. I left early in the morning and arrived at the trailhead a couple of hours after sunrise. There were only 2 other vehicles parked there, a regular-looking minivan and a rugged truck that looked like it had been through some serious off-roading, covered in mud and scratches. After parking, I set off down the trail. The air had a noticeable chill, so I pulled on my jacket and a hat to keep warm. Not long after starting, I passed an older guy walking with a young boy, probably his grandson. They looked like they had spent the night camping, which explained the minivan. When I finally got to the campsite, I expected to see one more person or group since there was still that muddy truck at the trailhead. To my surprise, the site was completely empty. It was a flat patch of grass near a small pond with clear, gently flowing water. No tents, no signs of life, just me. I picked a spot near the trees and set up my tent. For a while, I sat by the tent writing in my journal, enjoying the quiet. As the hours passed, though, the temperature started dropping. I decided to build a campfire to stay warm. Not long after I had the fire going, I noticed someone walking down the trail. It was a man, maybe in his early 40s, wearing a thick coat and a cloth covering most of his face. He had a small backpack slung over one shoulder, but it looked odd, flat, like it barely had anything inside. The man walked to the other side of the campsite and leaned against a tree. I assumed he must have a friend coming down the trail behind him or maybe had plans to meet someone there. But after about 45 minutes, no one else showed up, and the man had not moved. He just sat there, staring out at the pond. I could not decide whether to feel sorry for him or uneasy about the situation. Then, out of nowhere, he stood up and walked over to me. He stopped just on the other side of the campfire, smiled at me through the flickering flames, and sat down. I tried to be polite, smiling back and saying, "It's okay," but something about him made me uncomfortable. His smile felt wrong, his mouth curved up, but his eyes looked tired and dull, almost sad. It was like his face could not decide what emotion it wanted to show. I tried to make small talk, asking, "Did you bring a tent? It is going to get colder tonight." He shook his head no but kept that unsettling smile on his face. He did not seem worried in the slightest. For the next 10 minutes, we sat in silence, and the tension in the air grew heavier with each passing second. I had already decided I did not want to stay, but I was nervous about packing up while he was sitting right there, watching me. The sun was setting fast, and I knew if I was going to leave, it had to be soon. I stood up, walked over to my tent, and started rolling up my sleeping bag. I could feel his gaze on me the entire time. When I turned around, he was still staring, the firelight casting strange shadows on his face. Then, without a word, he stood up, his eyes locked on me the whole time. He turned and walked back toward the tree he had been leaning on earlier but did not stop. Instead, He kept walking into the woods until he disappeared into the shadows. I froze, straining to hear his footsteps, but the forest was eerily silent. My instincts were screaming at me that something was not right. I quickly packed up the rest of my gear and started heading back down the trail. I left the campfire burning, hoping that if he was watching from somewhere in the trees, he would think I was still there. For the next 2 hours, I walked as fast as I could without running, constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced that at any moment I would see him following me. It was incredibly unnerving walking through the dark, with the freezing cold biting at my face, and the weight of fear pressing down on me. Every step felt like an eternity, and my heart pounded with every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. The whole time, I was just praying I would not hear his footsteps rushing up behind me. Thankfully, I made it back to my car safely. The relief I felt climbing in and locking the doors was almost overwhelming. I wasted no time starting the engine and getting out of there. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, something caught my attention. The old, muddy truck that had been parked at the trailhead earlier was gone. That sent a chill down my spine. If that truck was not his, then how had that man even gotten there? There was no sign of another vehicle, and the nearest town was miles away. The thought made my stomach turn. Looking back, I am certain that if I had stayed the night, something terrible would have happened. Maybe he had gone into the woods to retrieve something, a weapon or some other kind of preparation, planning to come back later. Or worse, maybe he had deliberately walked off, hoping to lull me into a false sense of security, waiting for the right moment to return when I was asleep or distracted. The possibilities of what could have happened that night still linger in my mind, creeping into my thoughts when I least expect it. Whatever his intentions were, I am just glad I listened to my gut and left. But the unease from that experience never truly went away. That man and his unsettling smile will likely haunt me for the rest of my life. Thank you for listening. Story 4. I was deep in the wilderness of Washington State, spending a few days backpacking through the rugged beauty of the national parks. By the time this happened, I had already hiked about 20 miles away from the nearest road. For the first 2 days, I had not seen a single soul. It was the beginning of autumn, and the chill in the air probably kept most people away, but I was prepared with all the right gear for the season. That morning, I woke up early, brewed myself a quick cup of coffee over my pocket stove, and prepared to head to my next campsite. It was a 6-mile hike ahead of me, and in the mountainous terrain, that meant a solid journey. About 4 hours into the trek, I heard the crunch of footsteps coming from up the trail. I glanced up and saw a man approaching, walking in the opposite direction. It caught me off guard, as I had not expected to run into anyone out there. I nodded and offered a polite smile as he passed, but something about him struck me as odd. He was not carrying a backpack, no water bottle, no gear, nothing. He was dressed in a long-sleeved t-shirt and a pair of old hiking pants. After he passed, curiosity got the better of me, and I turned around for another look. To my surprise, he glanced back at me at the same moment. Not wanting to make things awkward, I quickly turned away and kept walking. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself he probably had a campsite nearby and was just out for a quick walk. But deep down, I knew there were no established campsites in that area. Still, I decided not to dwell on it. The hike grew more challenging as the hours went on, but eventually, I made it to my campsite. It was a small clearing with just enough space for a tent. The sight was underwhelming, to say the least. I had expected breathtaking views, but instead, the area was completely surrounded by trees, blocking any sightlines to the mountains or valleys below. It felt more like a random spot in the middle of a forest than a scenic mountaintop escape. Exhausted from the hike, I set up my tent, eager to relax and enjoy the fading sunlight. I sat outside, watching the last rays of the sun filter through the trees, when I suddenly heard a faint shuffling noise behind me. Turning around, I froze. It was the same man I had passed on the trail earlier. He still had no gear, no backpack, no food, no water. My stomach twisted in knots as I tried to make sense of it. He had been walking in the opposite direction when I last saw him, so for him to be here now, he must have turned around not long after passing me. He walked into the clearing, ignoring me entirely, as if I were invisible. Without a word, he settled on the other side of the small campsite, just sitting there on the ground, staring into the forest. From where I sat, only 15 feet away, I could now get a better look at him. He seemed to be in his late 30s, with short brown hair and a scruffy beard. There was something deeply unsettling about his presence. The way he moved, the way he acted, it all felt off. The sun continued to set, and the growing darkness only heightened my unease. Who was this guy? What was he doing miles away from civilization without any supplies? My mind raced with questions, but I knew one thing for sure: I did not feel safe. After about 30 minutes of sitting there without moving, he still had not acknowledged me. But I could not stay. I knew I needed to leave, even if it meant finding a random spot in the forest to set up camp for the night. I began to pack up my gear as quietly as possible, trying not to draw attention. That was when he finally looked at me. Once his gaze locked on mine, it did not waver. Every time I glanced in his direction, his eyes were still fixed on me, unblinking. With my backpack secured, I stood up, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw him rise as well. I started walking, trying to keep calm, but I could hear his footsteps behind me, following at a steady pace. My hand gripped the small knife in my pocket tightly, my heart racing with every step. After a few minutes, I glanced back over my shoulder. He was still following but seemed to be falling behind. Taking a deep breath, I made a split-second decision. I veered off the trail and plunged into the dense woods. The darkness was almost absolute by then, and I hoped it would conceal me. I prayed that he would not see where I had gone and would continue down the trail instead. I was maybe 20 feet deep into the woods when I stopped, pressing my back against a tree. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining to pick up any sound. I leaned out just enough to peer down the trail, my heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out everything else. About 30 seconds later, I heard his footsteps approaching. As he came into view, I held my breath. He was walking at a steady pace, but just as he was about to pass the spot where I had left the trail, he stopped. In the dim light, I could make out his figure standing there, motionless. He turned his head slowly, scanning the area around him like he knew I was nearby. My chest tightened as I watched him. Then, he started yelling. "Hey," he called out, his voice trying to sound friendly. "Hey, are you out there? You all right? You need any help?" The forced friendliness in his tone made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, like he was trying too hard to sound harmless. I stayed perfectly still, hoping he would move on. After a couple of minutes, his voice fell silent, but he did not turn back toward the campsite. Instead, to my horror, he stepped off the trail and into the woods, on the opposite side from where I was hiding. I watched his shadowy figure fade into the trees, and soon after, the forest grew quiet again. No more footsteps, no more yelling. Just silence. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, crouched low and barely moving. My mind was racing, every sound from the forest around me setting my nerves on edge. Eventually, after what must have been over an hour, I decided I had to move. Slowly, I got to my feet, my legs stiff from sitting so long. I kept my movements cautious, making sure to stay as quiet as possible as I retraced my steps out of the woods and back to the trail. My instincts screamed at me to get as far away as I could, so I pushed my body to the limit. I skipped the next campsite entirely, hiking straight through the night until I finally reached safety. When I made it back to town, I went straight to the local police station and filed a report about what had happened. I told them everything, the man on the trail, his strange behavior, and how he had followed me into the woods. But they never followed up with me. To this day, I do not know who that man was or what he was doing so far out in the wilderness with no supplies. Maybe he was living off the land, maybe he was waiting for unsuspecting hikers to rob, or worse, maybe he had something far more sinister in mind. Whatever the case, I am just grateful I trusted my gut and got out of there while I still could. Story 5. This happened just a little over 2 years ago. My name is Alex, and back then, I had absolutely no experience with camping. I had always wanted to give it a try, though, and I figured the best way to learn was to dive right in and do it. So, this was my very first camping trip. I picked a campground about 2 hours away from my hometown. It looked like a good balance, not too crowded but not completely deserted either, which felt perfect for someone trying this for the first time. I packed up my gear, hit the road, and got to the trailhead around noon. After parking and double-checking my stuff, I set off on the hike. It took me another couple of hours to reach the main campground area. The site itself was decent. There were a few sturdy park-style benches scattered around and a couple of those ground-mounted barbecue grills you see at picnic spots. From there, some smaller trails branched off to individual campsites, where a handful of people had already pitched their tents. I chose one of those offshoot paths, walked down, and dropped my things in a quiet spot. It took me about an hour to set up my tent and make sure everything was in order. By the time I finished, I noticed a few people gathering in the main area, chatting and grilling food. Now, I am not the most outgoing person, so I felt a little awkward about just walking up and joining them. About half an hour later, though, a guy came down the path to where I had set up. He introduced himself as Tyler and invited me to hang out with the group. He seemed friendly enough, so I figured, why not? I followed him back up and met a few of the other campers. They were a nice bunch, and we all hung out for a bit. After an hour or so, people started to head back to their tents, and I did the same, saying goodnight as I left. It was around 7 o'clock, about an hour before sunset, when Tyler showed up at my tent again. For context, he looked to be about my age, maybe mid to late 20s. This time, he asked if I had ever been to this area before. I told him it was my first visit. Then he asked if I had heard about a nearby lake. I shook my head, and his face lit up as he started talking about this incredible hidden lake that hardly anyone knew about. He said it was an awesome spot and suggested we go check it out before it got dark. I was intrigued, and he seemed trustworthy enough, so I decided to go. I left my things in the tent, grabbed a flashlight just in case, and followed him. Tyler said it was about a 10-minute walk through the woods, so I figured we had enough daylight left. The path we took was not a marked trail, it was more like a narrow footpath winding through the trees. It looked like it had been used a few times but was definitely not official. After about 10 minutes of walking, though, there was still no lake in sight. What struck me as odd was how quiet Tyler had gotten. Earlier, he was really talkative, cracking jokes and keeping the conversation going. But now, he was giving short, one-word answers and kept glancing at the sunset. At first, I thought he was just keeping an eye on the time, but something about his behavior made me uneasy. It almost felt like he was stalling, waiting for the sun to go down. By the time 20 minutes had passed, I started to feel a growing sense of unease. The path seemed endless, and Tyler's silence was unnerving. I instinctively began to put some distance between us. My adrenaline was kicking in, and even though I could not pinpoint why, my gut was telling me something was not right. The sunlight was fading fast, leaving only thin streaks of light between the trees. The forest felt eerily quiet, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The fading sunlight cast long shadows, and I could feel a chill creeping into the air. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there. When I thought I saw an opening, I turned around and tried to slip away, moving as quietly as I could. But my attempt at sneaking away did not go unnoticed. "Hey, where are you going?" Tyler's voice called out, still holding that friendly tone, like he was trying to play it cool. But when I kept moving, his tone shifted almost instantly to one of frustration and anger. "Stop," he yelled, and I could hear the sound of him running after me. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest as I pushed myself to run as fast as I could. The sound of his footsteps pounded behind me, his shouts cutting through the quiet forest. I could tell he was gaining on me, and I felt a surge of panic. It was like every survival instinct I had was kicking into overdrive. The chase must have lasted about a minute, but it felt like an eternity. Then, just as I thought I was starting to lose him, I heard a sharp metallic clang behind me. I glanced over my shoulder for the briefest moment, and my stomach dropped. A knife had struck a tree just a few feet away, bouncing off the bark with a loud thud. It must have been his last desperate attempt to stop me. That moment only made me run faster. Somehow, I managed to shake him. My legs burned, my lungs were on fire, but I did not stop until I made it back to the main campground. The sight of other people felt like a lifeline. I stumbled over to the group, breathing hard and trying to explain what had happened. The words came out jumbled, but they understood enough to know something was seriously wrong. One of the campers pulled out their phone and immediately called the police. Everyone looked around nervously, but Tyler, or whoever he really was, never came back. As we pieced things together, I realized something chilling. The others said Tyler had been at the campsite when they arrived, but no one had seen him set up a tent. After looking around, it became clear he had no gear, no supplies, nothing. It was like he was never planning to stay the night. The more I thought about it, the more I realized he must have targeted me. I was alone, a newbie at camping, and probably looked like an easy mark. Whatever his intentions were, I am grateful I did not stick around to find out. If I had, I am not sure I would be here to tell this story.